And we are back with our Under Pressure series, our week of prayer theme for this week. Today, the pressure that we'll be going over is personal bias. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is the Good Samaritan, which holds near and dear to my heart. It anchors me in what I believe in and how I see God, how I see Christianity, how I see what it means to be a Christian. And I think it's just so interesting how the story is formatted. Is not to go too long reading the text. I'm not going to read the text. But it goes, a Levite and a priest pass by this person who has just been robbed and beaten. And then they both completely ignore him and walk past. Yet this person who's a Samaritan, whom the Jews hated, passes by and sees the man and takes care of him, gives him his donkey, gives him a place to stay, tends to his wounds, goes out of his way to take care of this man. And the question that Jesus is answering to this teacher of the law, to this person who's supposed to be an expert in the Bible, who's supposed to be an expert in the rules, an expert in all things religious, he says, "Who is the neighbor?" Yet the person responds, "The one who had mercy on him." He doesn't even say the Samaritan. The reason he does that is because the story that had been told originally, before Jesus says it, that the one we all know, the Good Samaritan, the star of the story wasn't a Samaritan, it was actually a Jew. For when people back then talked about neighbor, actually when they said neighbor, they meant a fellow Israelite or a fellow Jew. In other words, somebody like them. So when they heard the story, they thought, oh, of course, anybody of all classes, anybody of all levels of life who is a Jew, who is an Israelite, who is like us, yet may not have the same religious status or the same place in society, they can be a neighbor too. They can be righteous, they can be Christian too. Yet Jesus puts as the star of the story somebody who they hate, somebody who they think is filthy, somebody who they think is tainted, and they make it a Samaritan. Now he says, if you just base it simply off how they acted, if you base it simply off how they loved, if they based it simply off their character, now who's Christian? Now who's a child of God? Now who's righteous? And it completely rewires the entire brain of the teacher, that he can't even say the word the Samaritan was the good person, the Samaritan was the righteous person. Jesus shifts it from a bias of class and a bias of place in society to a bias of ethnicity, a bias of race, a bias of religious boundaries. But I wonder, what would Jesus say today in modern day? We just looked at the people and switched around the characters to challenge our own personal bias and just simply look at the people as individuals. What if the star of the story wasn't a Samaritan? What if the star of the story, and we read the story this time, the good atheist? Or read the story this time saying, the good homosexual. And we just looked at the story, we looked at how they treated people, we looked at how they loved, what kind of love they gave. How would we respond? Would we be willing to say, even though that person's an atheist, he acted far more Christian than any of the pastors, any of the priests, any of the teachers, any of the religion teachers? If we called it the good homosexual and we just based it off his character and how he loved, would we be willing to be humble and say, that homosexual, that person was far more loving, far more Christ-like than any of the pastors, any of the ministers, any of the teachers? That's what this pressure is dealing with. It's important that we face our pressure of personal bias. That, just like we talked about yesterday, we deal with our discomfort. It may feel uncomfortable, it may feel like a weight, it may feel weird to deal and to think about people in that way. But when we look at people as simply individuals, we start seeing the way God sees us. We start understanding what grace means and what all that entails. There's this book I'm reading that is very great about depression and dealing with trauma. But something they talk about in like the first chapter is how none of the students in their first year who are supposed to be counselors, supposed to be psychology majors, supposed to be dealing with people through counseling, the professor tells them, do not read any textbooks for the whole first year and just simply deal with your patients. And he says the reason why is because I'll have students come up to me all the time and saying, oh, is this patient this, or this? They have these symptoms, they show these traits. Are they schizophrenic or whatever? And then the professor goes, how about we just call him Michael? How about let's not look at them as somebody who needs help? How about let's not look at them as somebody who is in pain, but as an individual? And I think that's exactly how the story of the Good Samaritan shows us and challenges us to look at people. It says in 1 Samuel 16 verse 7, it says, the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. When we look at people's heart, when we look at people's character, it's hard to judge them. I don't remember who told me this. Somebody said, it's hard to judge somebody when you're close to them. That closeness, that change in proximity, that change in distance between people you feel uncomfortable with. Being close to people who you don't necessarily vibe with, or you don't necessarily get along with. Or people who you may tend to have a personal bias to. Maybe they're an atheist, maybe they believe differently than you. Maybe they act differently than you. Maybe they dress differently than you. But that's exactly what pressure does. When you place yourself close to people who are different than you, you begin to see more and more the way that God does. Less on the outward appearance and more on the inside. Thank you for joining us for Under Pressure. I'll see you guys tomorrow.